All right, let's go ahead and get started. It's 8:31. So thank you all for coming. And I keep losing my script here. It keeps disappearing off the screen here. So welcome to Cultural Competence and Evaluation. What does it look like and how we're doing? We're going to explore what CCE is, Cultural Competence and Evaluation, why it's important, and other related topics. And I hope we're going to have a lot of input from the audience as we do that. So as we're sitting there listening to the panelists, think of good questions to challenge them when it's your turn. We have 4 great panelists today. I'm going to introduce them all shortly. And each of them will have a short presentation, and together I think those are going to present a pretty complete and well-rounded picture of CCE and the key issues around it. After each presentation, I'll entertain any audience questions that I think need to be answered right away, like clarification questions. But otherwise, I'll probably hold questions till the end of the presentations, and then introduce those so that everybody has a chance to talk to them. And I've got some of my own questions just in case we need them to drive the conversation forward. First, want to share an icebreaker question with the audience. And as you probably know by now, the purpose of this is to get you thinking a little bit about the topic, but also to make sure you're familiar with how the chat function works. So please think about the question, and if you have a good response, put it in the chat function. The question is, what is something about you that you haven't shared with colleagues because of concerns about how they would react or how it would affect you at work? So what's something about you that you haven't shared with colleagues because you're concerned about how they would react about that or how it would affect your work? So please go ahead and provide your thoughts about that. I'm going to give you a minute while I try to figure out where the chat function is. And oh, there it is right there. I can pull that up and I can see any questions. And give a few seconds, but maybe won't delay us. I'll go ahead and start with the introductions and go into each person's presentation while you have time to think about some of those issues. So as I said, we have 4 panelists today. We have Sarah Castor, Jeremy Offenstein, Quinn Parker, and Alex Dunn. And we have one response up here. Let's see. Quinn's answering that at one point in her career, she didn't share anything about her children. That's an interesting thing. So yeah. And maybe prod you about that a little bit as we go on. But so let's go with Sarah Castor. She's program manager for evaluation and engineering at Energy Trust of Oregon, where she has spent the last 13 years evaluating energy efficiency and renewable energy programs and designing research about all types of utility customers, buildings, and technology categories to deliver critical insights to improve Energy Trust service to customers. She's a native Oregonian, committed to ensuring that energy efficiency and renewables are accessible and affordable to all Oregonians. Outside of work, she enjoys playing piano, knitting, and watching the humorous baking show Nailed It with her 6- and 8-year-old kids. So Sarah, take it away and tell us what you have to tell us.
Thanks. Let me see if I can share my slides here. All right, can you see my slide?
I can see it.
Great.
Yeah.
All right.
Although it looks like it's still in presentation. It's still in review mode.
Oh darn. Let's
there
see.
You go. Nope. No, it's back to you.
Yeah. Let me.
While she's doing that, Sarah said that for a long time she didn't share that she doesn't own a bike. It's so big at Energy Trust.
It is so big. Everybody's a bike commuter except for me, the max. Okay. Let's see. How about now?
Yeah, that looks good.
Okay, that'll teach me to test things out. Okay, well, good morning, everybody. As Ryan said, I work at Energy Trust of Oregon. I would like to give the elevator pitch about Energy Trust for anybody who has not been aware of our work. We are an independent nonprofit. We serve the 1.6 million customers of the largest investor-owned utilities in Oregon with renewable energy and energy efficiency programs. And we serve customers across the state in rural areas, urban areas. We have commercial programs, industrial, agricultural programs, residential programs, programs for renters, homeowners. We have to serve a lot of different types of customers, as I'm sure many folks here do in their line of work. And that means that we need to learn about all these different types of customers and communicate with them about what we do. And so that's a big driver for the value of cultural competence in our evaluation. This is a slide that I share with a lot of people around the organization when we talk about what's the purpose and function of research and evaluation at Energy Trust. And I shamelessly stole this from Simon Sinek's Start With Why, because I think it's really important to talk about why we do what we do before we talk about all the tools that we use. So I really see our group and all the practitioners here who work on evaluation research as building knowledge and promoting learning throughout our industry and our organizations. You know, we're here to improve the effectiveness and transparency of programs and operations. And the way that we do this is by providing credible, timely, and most importantly, unbiased information to decision makers. And that's, I think, where culturally competent evaluation really comes in. We can't provide information that will support programs if it reflects our own personal biases or our personal circumstances. We have to do this in a way where we're talking to and about our customers and our communities in ways that are culturally relevant. It has to be a part of all the ways that we collect and analyze information. And so here are some of the tools that we have started using at Energy Trust for culturally competent evaluation. As an organization, we have a diversity, equity, and inclusion lens that we use for our work. And our group, our evaluation group, has adapted this lens to be specific to evaluation research and data projects. And so we use this lens when we're scoping projects or when we're contracting for evaluation and research. And it includes questions about, you know, what types of groups we're including in the research, how can they be involved in the scoping of the project or in reviewing the results. We ask ourselves about what the limitations or the bias of any data or methods might be when we're scoping a project. And then we ask how, you know, how conclusions or recommendations might impact the groups that we're interested in, and how could we potentially mitigate any negative impacts of our research. We also have diversity, equity, inclusion questions in all the requests for proposals and qualifications that we issue for research and evaluation contractors. We're asking firms to tell us about their firm ownership and their employee composition. We want to use teams that are diverse or reflective of customers that we're interested in learning about. We also ask them about their internal policies and practices around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we ask for examples of culturally competent evaluations or research that they've done so that we can see how they practice. We are always trying to involve more people in scoping and conducting our evaluations and research. You know, internally, that looks like talking to more folks from our customer service and our outreach teams and our marketing teams who probably have a closer relationship with our customers. And we're also trying to work externally with community groups, business and trade groups, and other partner organizations in scoping our work. And this is new, you know, this is something that we haven't done as much of. And it's time consuming and it's really complex, but it's really valuable at the same time. And then we're also, as a group, learning and talking about culturally competent evaluation on a regular basis. We go to sessions like this at conferences, we read articles and we talk about them. And the Oregon Program Evaluator Network is an organization that I like to plug because they talk about culturally competent evaluation on a regular basis. It's a great opportunity to talk with other evaluators. So that's all I'll share for now, and I'm happy to take your questions now or later. Thank you.
There we go.
Ryan. There you go.
Anybody have anything that they want to ask Sarah to clarify, or something you need answered right now? Carla asked, "Is this DEI lens something Energy Trust created or developed, or I guess is it something that you borrowed from somebody else or were influenced?" Oh, you're muted now.
We've had a couple of versions of the lens as an organization. We worked with a DEI consultant to come up with a first version, but I think, we've taken it internally and added to it. And the one that we use specifically for research and evaluation is something that we as a group discussed and came up with. And it is a set of questions that we ask ourselves every time we're scoping a project or hiring a consultant.
Yeah, it's a set of questions they ask their consultants too, as I can testify. Difficult questions too, sometimes. Harper has her hand up, or has a hand up.
Yeah, thank you. I just had a quick question. As I've been searching around, learning about DEI, I've seen diversity, equity, and belonging as a term that's been thrown out. And it's gotten me thinking about inclusion. Just because you're including people isn't enough, but you need them to feel belonging. As you've gone through this, have you heard, or what, do you have any thoughts on inclusion versus belonging, the difference, or how it might be used in outreach, that sort of stuff?
It's an interesting question. And I like that distinction. I think for us, we treat the word inclusion the way that a lot of people would treat belonging. It really is about bringing folks in and making sure that they're heard, that they feel heard. So I think that we're hopefully getting at the same things. It's an interesting distinction.
Okay, I guess a follow-up question to that, so we actually chose to use belonging at Energy 350, and the reason was that including people is one thing, but belonging is where you actively work on building your culture to one where they feel like they can be themselves. Because, we have a predominantly white male culture at Energy 350, and we're trying to be very clear with that. If we don't make certain efforts, then the assumptions that we make are the ones that become dominant. So the belonging part is really to kind of focus on, like, let's change the assumptions. Let's not have every activity be around sports, because not everybody is into that. I'm not really into sports at all. So as an example.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think when you're talking about internal efforts too, especially having employees feel a sense of belonging to the organization. I think when we're talking about customers and it's, I don't know if belonging to Energy Trust would be quite the right term, but I agree that for internal efforts with your own employees, that belonging is really an important concept.
So Carla had a follow-up to the earlier question, and why don't we do this and then move on to Jeremy? The follow-up question is, the DEI lens or frameworks something that Energy Trust has shared publicly? And I would love to see an example if available, interested in the specific questions you are asking as part of this framework.
I'll put email in the chat. I don't think we've shared our DEI lens for research and evaluation publicly. I think the organization-wide one might be shared, but I'll put my information in there. And we can...
Okay, thanks, Sarah. That was really great. Let's move on next to Jeremy. Jeremy Offenstein is a director at ADM Associates, just as I am, and has been performing energy efficiency evaluations for 10 years and has over 20 years of applied research and evaluation experience. He's completed evaluations of low-income serving programs, published work on campus racial climate, and assessed differential rates of college success for students of different race and ethnicity. Jeremy's a lifelong angler, and he's done bait fishing from party boats as well as sharing a fly rod with his daughter at a trout stream, and enjoys trim carpentry as opportunity allows. I didn't get a chance to look up what trim carpentry is opposed to any other kind of carpentry, but Jeremy is going to talk a little bit more details about what cultural competent evaluation is and some examples of it. Take it away, Jeremy.
Thanks, Ryan. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here if all goes well. Right. So good morning, everyone. In my opening remarks, I wanted to speak about how I think striving for increased cultural competence can impact the evaluation work we do, and some steps that evaluators working in the energy area can take to increase cultural competence of their work, as well as the barriers and challenges that may be present. I think this is an area that generally could use more attention in this area in my own work, as well as from what I've seen, publicly available in other work more broadly. And I'm going to provide some brief background on cultural competence, as well as a focus on some potential tactics for increasing cultural competence. Okay. So I think a really important aspect of cultural competence, and all this information comes from the American Evaluation Association statement on cultural competence, is to understand that this is a process and it's not an end state that is achieved at one point. That is, it is characterized as a process of learning, unlearning, and relearning. In other words, cultural competence is something that we strive for rather than something that's achieved at any given point. Importantly, the knowledge that allows for culturally competent evaluation for one project may not be transferable to another. And I think that goes back to the issue of this is a process. That is, in understanding the people and place where a given program is operating and who it's serving, that information does not necessarily transfer to another area. So before going into high-level tactics for improving cultural competence and evaluation, I wanted to give some examples of how a focus on cultural competence can shape evaluation. And these examples come from other areas, not the energy area, but I think they provide some context for understanding how this focus can shape evaluation design, scope, and measurement approaches. In the first example, the evaluator's engagement with an American Indian and Alaska Native community served the program shaped the evaluation by altering the basic methodology that was used in the study. In this case, the community pointed to that students with transient attendance were a particular need for the program. And this concern led the evaluators to modify the design from using a random sample as originally planned to allowing, that was recruited at the time of the baseline period, to allowing enrollments throughout the study period so they can have that focus. Additionally, in the second example, the evaluators considered cultural variables to understand the mechanisms by which the program produced its impacts. The focus on these variables led them, they believe, to insight that hiring program staff of similar backgrounds to the students served as a key success factor for the program. And in the final example, something that's maybe a little more concrete is that the evaluators use the cultural values of the population studies to influence the design of their survey instrument, and specifically replacing multiple choice responses with more open-ended because that was more congruent with the values of that culture. I think these examples provide some illustrations of how this focus can have potentially very tangible impacts on the evaluation and understanding of findings. So in thinking about how one might improve the cultural competence of their evaluation, I came up with some ideas and tactics that I think are applicable. As an initial point, I think it's a value for evaluators to assess what resources may be available to them. For example, what stakeholder community groups have been engaged in the process of program design and implementation. Are there groups that program staff may be aware of but have not been engaged? And are there community organizations working in the area serving special populations? That and then engaging with various community stakeholders, those activities can provide an understanding of the values and perspectives of different community groups. With that information, the evaluator can review program logic and reflect on whether or not the inputs, outputs, and outcomes and the links between them make sense for the community being served by the program. Similarly, the reflection can affect the survey instrument design, a process that could be similar to something where you use open-ended interviews, for example, on a topic to inform the survey design. So I do think that there are a number of challenges to engaging in culturally competent evaluation. One of these is that funders are typically defining the outcomes of interest and scope of the evaluation. And as Sarah mentioned, for ETO, this is the Energy Trust, this is a priority, but that's not necessarily always the case. So to the extent that the funders are influencing what's important to them in terms of understanding how the program operates, it can limit the ability to allow for space for different activities to improve the cultural competence of the evaluation. Related to that is that evaluation budgets can also affect how much scope can be allocated to engaging in these sorts of activities. And lastly, I think, program budgets, they're limited as well. And the extent that program staff have the ability to engage with different community members can be affected by the budget and therefore limit the resources available to the evaluator as well. So just a few concluding thoughts on this interesting area. I think that it's important to keep a focus on that, cultural competence is a state or is a process and not a state that's achieved. And that when we engage in our work, we should reflect on how we can improve cultural competence despite potential constraints. A reflective practice on cultural competence provides an opportunity to improve the evaluation. Questioning our assumptions and the limitations of our methods may lead to better outcomes of the evaluation. And then lastly, despite potential challenge that there is, I think value in trying to integrate this focus into our work more. So that concludes my opening remarks.
Stuff again. So thank you very much, Jeremy. Great stuff there. I just realized as you were talking that I had meant to read the first poll question before you started. So while people are thinking of questions for Jeremy, can we put up the first poll question, Nick, which is what percentage of the energy-related research you've seen addresses cultural differences and does a good job of it? So just choose one, and let's leave that up there for a little bit and see if anybody has any additional questions or any clarifications from Jeremy. I thought one of the important points you made, Jeremy, was talking about challenges to culturally competent evaluation, and one of the questions that I had saved for later, but I think might be this might be a good place to jump in with it, is what are the potentially adverse impacts of a culturally incompetent evaluation? And wondering if anybody has examples of an evaluation where there was inadequate consideration of cultural differences and that created a recognizable problem. And specifically just curious about what the evaluation did wrong in that situation. Does anybody have any thoughts on that? If not, we can let that kind of stew in people's minds and circle back to that later. How are we doing on that poll question? Can we see, do we have some responses to that, Nick? Oh yeah, Lauren Bates also asked, do you have any thoughts about culture related to organizations or field? For example, Lauren's doing a lot of market research to learn how HVAC contractors do their jobs. So there's a layer of professional culture and norms to consider there.
Yeah, I think that's an important consideration. That's something that I had thought about too, because I even see that to some extent in our own organization. We have people practicing in different areas and they have different kind of expertise and a lens that they're bringing when we, for example, collaborate on the design of a survey. So I do think that is the idea of professional cultures existing, and as being something that is also worth thinking about in the evaluation is an important one.
And Ryan, about the poll, we had 16 votes to answer, and 10 said less than 10%, and 6 said between 10 and 25%.
Okay, so it's not happening, and I'm accused by Kiel of asking a double-barreled question. He says it's really 2 questions, one. And yes, I was actually very aware of that as I devised the question. Basically, looking for responses to the more restrictive of the 2 conditions posed in the question. So, thanks for bringing that to my attention in front of all these people. Okay, any other questions? Lauren, Kiel says it wasn't trying to accuse. No, it's quite all right. I'm fine. Yeah, and Lauren thinks your response was helpful. So good. Then in that case, let's move on to Quinn Parker. Quinn, I'm going to bring my little cheat sheet over here in the front main screen, so I'm not looking off to the side while I read this. Quinn's a facilitator and strategic consultant with 15 years of professional experience working with utilities, nonprofits, and public organizations. She's the founder and CEO of Encolor, a firm that supports diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. She's a certified diversity professional, a qualified administrator of the Intercultural Development Inventory, a Lean Six Sigma Green Belt, and a member of the board of directors of AESP and of the DEI Council. And one of her current sources of fun is playing on an adult kickball team. So that sounds like a lot of fun indeed. Okay, Quinn, go ahead and tell us what's on your mind.
Yes, can everyone see my screen?
I can see it. It looks good.
Fantastic. Good morning, everyone. I'm excited to have the opportunity to share just a little bit with you around cultural competency. As you can see from the title of my initial slide, we're going to pivot just a little bit. My colleagues have done a really great job at talking through what a cultural competent evaluation may look like, both in theory and practice. And so I want to discuss with you what does becoming a culturally competent evaluator look like? And as Ryan mentioned, cultural competency, this is a journey, it's a process, and becoming culturally competent is also a journey. We will continue to become as we learn, not just about ourselves, but about the communities that we work with. So today, I want to just touch briefly on a couple of aspects of cultural competency. You've already essentially heard the definition of what it is, and I'll go over it again briefly. I want to talk about why this is important and how can we leverage this in the work that we do every day with our customers and our clients. So the general idea, the general concept around cultural competency is being able to understand, appreciate, and interact with folks that are from cultures or beliefs other than your own. This is not only about yourself, but about others. And so you ask, why is this so important? According to the American Evaluation Association, and I have paraphrased some of their content here, it's the right thing to do. really being able to understand who we're evaluating, who we're researching, provides better context for us to analyze and provide recommendations. It helps to support validity. It ensures that diverse voices and perspectives are heard, that they're represented fairly and honestly, and that we're able to interpret what we're seeing in a way that's appropriate and resonates with the community that we are evaluating. Really understanding how to have folks move towards a target behavior requires us to understand the culture and the social norms. And then third, evaluation impacts our values and perspectives. We all have a lens that colors the way we live, the way we work. It impacts the way we evaluate. It impacts the questions we ask and the conclusions we draw from our work. So it's important for us not only to scrutinize ourselves and really understand and assess ourselves on where we are at in this cultural competency journey, but understand the culture of others and those that we're working with. So just a few ideas on how we can start thinking and becoming a more culturally competent evaluator. Let's assess ourselves, better understanding where we are in our own cultural competency journey. There are many, many different resources available online to do self-assessments. They will not answer all your questions. They will not give you every clue you need to move forward, but it will be a beginning for you to say, where do I start? Where do I need to work on myself? What research do I need to do? What understanding should I have to be better at this job? In that process, we acknowledge our own biases and assumptions. We all have them. They impact the way we analyze and report information. The first step is awareness, knowing they exist and having the ability to step back and make adjustments when you see them impacting the way we do our work. We also need to recognize the power dynamic. As an evaluator, as the individuals that are making decisions on whether a program was successful or not, an initiative hit its goals or not, we're in a position of power and potentially in a place where we can dismiss the viewpoints of others. So let's be careful and that we're not drawing conclusions quickly without taking in information from those that maybe are not in the same position of authority we're in. And let's attempt to mitigate our biases by bringing in a diversity and equity filter. ETO brings in their lens. It helps them to step back and have a very objective methodology to help mitigate biases in the way they're evaluating and researching. We all should have some filter or lens that we use when we're doing this work. And we should also make sure to include different folks with different perspectives on your evaluation team. It is critical that you have different people involved in your evaluation process because that perspective will help you, will result in a better product. And if at all possible, vet some of your assumptions, some of your recommendations, some of your analysis with the folks that are most likely to be impacted by the results of your report. You will likely find that you drew assumptions that are not accurate or may need additional context. So that's the end of my slides. Happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you, Quinn. I'm just looking at the chats and oh, Carol, Sam Mahaney has broadcast something. Looking if any particular. Somebody, Lauren wants to see your contact information again, Quinn. Can you throw that slide back up there?
Absolutely.
And give a moment for a question from the audience. One of the takeaways I got from your presentation, Quinn, is that culturally competent evaluation is hard. It requires more resource. You have to involve more people. You have to spend more time at it than normally. It's easy and quick to do things from your own filter, but getting the input you need to find out, how that may be not the appropriate filter for a particular evaluation, requires resources. So my question is, what's the added cost of doing culturally competent evaluation? And maybe Sarah can answer, because the related question is, are program administrators willing to pay the extra cost? And or is there a when and why that they might be willing to pay that cost? So do we have some comments about that, perhaps?
I think Sarah likely has some very practical numbers perhaps around the increased costs, but it's also an increased cost of time, and it's worth the investment. I think it's important for us to step back and slow down, but we all work on very usually annual cycles that require evaluation to happen in a specific time frame. So it also takes a certain level of planning. We have to assume cultural competency and mitigating some of these barriers that we may have in doing this process early on. In your early evaluation planning, you should make some assumptions around how we're going to include cultural competency in our evaluation and make time for that. It shouldn't be an afterthought.
Yeah, I definitely agree with Quinn. I don't think budgets are what is keeping us from doing culturally competent evaluations and research a lot of the time. I think it is timeline. Sometimes it just takes longer to do a really comprehensive, well-planned evaluation. It takes, including people you may not have worked with before. Sometimes you have to build some relationships. But as Quinn said, it's absolutely worth taking that time and investing in that evaluation if you want to get results that are really going to help you achieve your goals.
Ryan, you're muted, just in case you.
It looks like Keel has a question. Keel, did you have a question to ask? It says, I have a question, and then it says, great question.
Yeah, you kind of asked the question for me. It was around budget and time, but I guess kind of
Thanks.
Budget and time are obviously very connected. Time is money. There's something we come across a lot in SEM, is that SEM is a year-long program, but it's supposed to be a multiple year program, but we do 1 year at a time because everybody has their goal they're trying to reach for the year to meet their budgets. So when I'm just thinking of culture and the idea of trying to integrate into a culture to understand it better, to interact and to mitigate biases and things like that, it just takes a long time. I've been married to my wife who's Vietnamese for 16 years, and I'm still like scratching the surface, it feels like, of understanding Vietnamese culture. So with these, like, do you think there's an opportunity in the future where we can move away from annual budget concerns into one where we can actually work towards understanding that, like, that interacting with different cultures and understanding all of this is going to take much longer than one budget cycle? Or is that just something that has to happen over time, and regardless of budget cycle, he's got to figure it out? Like, is there anything is this a conversation people are having, or?
I think this is a conversation people are having because we are acknowledging that to really move the needle and understand better how to work with cultures other than our own, it takes time, likely longer than 12 months. A strategy that I've seen that is, again, I'm not sure how well it's going to work. We're all just beginning to dive deeply into how to do this better, is to have a hybrid approach of goals and metrics that are multi-year, focused on engagement and competency and building capacity around engaging with different communities, at the same time keeping our typical metrics of hitting certain programmatic goals such as savings or customer satisfaction or the typical energy efficiency goals, and looking at them together, I think that gives an opportunity for us to even provide more context to those engagement goals, as you're seeing some of your more metric, quantitative goals and how they impact those qualitative engagement goals. There's an opportunity to learn and grow and pivot as we learn more.
Thank you. Also realized that when I said great question, I was not referring to my own question. I can read that now and say, oh my God, that's terrible. I meant your question was a great question, Ryan.
Thank you. Okay. Okay. Let's move on to our last speaker. I was just reminded we have 20 minutes or now 19 minutes left in the regular session, although we could spill over a little bit. But let's move on. But just before that, why don't we put up that second poll question? And that's which of the following describes your level of familiarity with culturally competent evaluation? You may select one or more. A, I'm somewhat familiar with the phrase cultural competence and evaluation. B, I have seen references made to the AEA statement on cultural competence and evaluation. C, I am thoroughly familiar with the AEA statement on cultural competence and evaluation. And D, I authored the AEA statement on cultural competence and evaluation. And then I have not authored an evaluation using CCE. So yeah, give you a couple of minutes to respond to that. This is really cool. It's I'm seeing the responses in real time. Looks like somewhat familiar is the modal response with just over half of the responses, followed by seen some references and or actually I have not authored an evaluation using CCE common. Okay, sounds good. Let's move on then. Thank you everybody for that. Alex Dunn is, I'm gonna once again bring my, oh, that doesn't work. She's director at ILLUME Advising. She's got over 15 years of applied research experience, most of them in the energy industry. She leads large-scale research projects in areas such as designating disadvantaged communities, rate design, midstream market transformation, and marketing assessments, and is working with New York State's Climate Justice Working Group to develop New York's disadvantaged communities criteria. When not working, she's learning that coaching her kids' soccer team is harder than herding cats. Last week, she inspired her kids to play in a downpour by showing them how to slide across the muddiest part of the field. Alex is going to close things up by kind of exploring some of the other issues around cultural competence evaluation, including the ethics of it. And so with that, I'll let you go ahead, Alex.
Okay, I will share my screen and see how this goes. I'm just going to eschew the presentation mode and just go this way. Then I don't have the issues. So we've heard like the progression and seeing this from within Energy Trust organization to how it works in evaluations, and then also how to integrate this. What I want to kind of talk to is just pushing us even further. And there's a couple reasons for that. Is you like, what's your goal with culturally competent evaluations or research in general? And this gets to the point of what are the costs that the question that was just asked, and my flip to that is really I think we're often talking about the cost of what it is to include it, but we're invisible to the cost of not including it because it has been so understudied. And frankly, that's the part that really worries me. So in my view, evaluators, researchers, program designers have to shift how things have been, kind of the status quo, and especially with culturally competent research and evaluation, it's now time to start integrating as much as we can to create more than just the metrics, but also start to think about how programs need to shift and be designed. And that's a critical component of evaluations, not just how much the savings are. That's a very critical component too, but also when you're trying to shift how programs are implemented, and if we really need to make this change in our industry, it has to happen in a way that is using new tools and new designs. And so that means quite a lot. Jane Peters just wrote a really great article on participatory action research, which I would urge everyone to read. I think that is one tool in the toolbox that we now need to use. And part of me says this because of this thing. I'm a cognitive scientist by training, and this was something that really stuck with me as I learned it in school. The concepts of in-group and out-group, I think, are really important here. And when we think of in-group versus out-group, we're like, oh, the in-crowd versus the out-crowd. That's kind of how people have used this term, and that's incorrect. It's actually, we are part of many different in-groups. And psychologically, what that does to you, cognitively, what that does to you is that you see out-groups differently. And this is a cognitive thing. This is how racism happens. This is how so many things happen, and it's just a very natural thing. If I was teaching a class and I divided people up into two groups and made them have this like little cohesive thing, then they'd start feeling that way about their group cohesion and think of the others as the out group. This happens fast, and it's visceral and strong. What that means is that culturally competent evaluations and research have to think about not just in-group, out-group within their research. It needs to pervade everything they do, and our research groups need to become more diverse. We need to have in-group researchers doing the research. And a good example of this is recently we just did these large community gatherings and focus groups. They were in language, so they were run in Spanish by Latinos, doing that work, gathering the information that needed to do this, to understand the disadvantaged work barriers in New York State. And that gave a lot of insight into what's really happening with those groups. So I'd push us all to start thinking about systematically changing how we hire, how we think about research, where we go, what we're learning. And so it's not just a lens, it's also about pushing ourselves to think differently about who we hire and what we're looking for and how we run our evaluations in that perspective. So in-group, out-group is one of those concepts that when I'm starting to run this work, I always want to be thinking about what's my bias in my group versus others, and where is that messing with my interpretation, and then start looking at other groups and thinking about this. It's a very big topic, very well researched and fascinating if you ever want to dig into it. Now to the ethics of this. As we start delving into this and put a lens into equity, DEI, and culturally competent evaluations, one of the things I wanted to mention is that we are now then researching and trying to ask of changes in programs to people who we don't fully understand yet. Again, that under-researched understanding. And I want us to always be thinking about this, and that's do no harm. What I've seen some recently is like, well, how can we get lower income customers to be okay with, say, financing to do an HVAC upgrade? I'm like, no, no, don't do that. That's not what you want to do. And so in this case, what you want to be thinking about here is not the current tools in your toolbox again, but thinking outside of that box. When you have to do this, your first element coming in is being open-minded, having the people there that can do the work and understand the culture and the relevancy of different kind of avenues, but then also do no harm. It has to be this way. If we're going to start going into this, we need to be thinking about both evaluation, research, and programs in a do no harm way. So financing is probably not a good tool in the toolbox to use for vulnerable populations. And there are many like that. So it often means that we have to take a step back and start really thinking about what am I doing, even if I want to kind of meet this goal. That's my very quick rundown. I'll stop sharing. We can chat.
Myself, there we go. Thank you, Alex. That was great. Appreciate that. Lisa wanted you to provide, the publication information about that Jane Peters article on participatory action research.
So it's Jane Peters, who you should always read whatever she writes. And I think it's from AESP, but I'm not sure. So I'll just put that in there.
Okay.
I'm slightly biased, by the way.
And Yasmin just thinks you're terrific. Or is she thanking all of us? Yasmin's thanking, I'm sorry, he or she thanking all of us for all these great presentations, I guess. And then Lauren comments, co-design of programs and evaluations, another thing to look into. Interesting comment there.
Yeah. Actually, can I respond to that?
Well,
Lauren, when you were mentioning researching HVAC groups and trying to understand things, I think that co-design is also really important. You know, when you think about the HVAC groups that you're trying to look into and the culture within them, you know, if you want to, there's some really great work you did in California about 5 years ago. If you want to look into, say, Spanish speakers or Latinos who are doing this work, you have to try to find them because they're mostly friends and family and word of mouth to get to the HVAC contractors. But you can also talk to the distributors that they're going to get them. It all has to be done in language and again, in-group researchers to do it, but that is a different culture and you're not going to find them in the same way that you would say like the traditional HVAC contractors who also have a very different culture, what you were speaking of within that. So there's that. And then I think inviting people into co-designing programs is actually a really cool idea. One of the things that's happening in New York State with this disadvantaged community designation that we're working on right now is that the environmental justice community advocates are there creating that designation with us. It's a long process and it's hard and challenging in many ways, but because they're doing that, we have much stronger basis. So it's not being designed from the evaluators or the researchers and saying like, here's what I did. It's taking in all their input and us reflecting it in a methodologically sound, nerdy way.
Keel asks, anyone ever tried to classify groups and the number of in-groups versus out-groups we belong to? Could be an interesting, eye-opening personal insight.
Yeah, this is something that in intergroup relations, when I was a teacher assistant for this in grad school, was trying to recognize all of the different in-groups, out-groups that you're in and part of, and also that you can formulate these and, you know, just a snap. And trying to recognize the privilege that you have from all of that really kind of pushes you to start thinking about, oh my goodness.
Yeah, I mean, is it basically an infinite number of divisions, or is there some practical limit to the meaningful number of in-groups you might belong to?
Well, the cognitive concept is that basically it's infinite, but I think that you can start classifying and understanding that, I am a white Latina. So that means, I can be an in-group in the kind of white space. I can also be part of the in-group of the Latino space. There's lots of different places like that. I'm queer. I can be part of the in-group there. And that also then pervades things. But what that means then cognitively is I see the differences amongst my queer fellow. And I often be like, oh, those straight people. And they're clumped in together, right? And so I start seeing them as like one group, and they have a cohesive kind of general way of looking at things. And that, to me, is what in-group, out-group really shares, is that you start trying to categorize an outgroup that you are not part of in a more simplistic way, and you don't see individual differences and characteristics of people in that group, because that is cognitively how we categorize. It's something to fight against.
Well, this sort of tees up one of the other questions I had prepared, which is that I guess what's the how far do we have to go in accounting for cultural differences in an evaluation? I mean, consider a place like California, you know, with incredible diversity of cultures, and if you're doing research there, you know, do you need to be able to understand every you know, potential culture you might be dealing with, even if it makes up, you know, 5% of the population?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. I mean, there's so many different ways we can group ourselves or slice up groups, and how do we go beyond kind of the traditional, more maybe more externally salient boundaries about what is one group and what is another group, and to understand, to Alex's point, the diversity within those groups, and know that there's something significant and important there that as evaluators of a program, or program designers for that matter, we should understand. I think it is a really interesting question, and it feels very open-ended to me, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, it's a meaningful question to me. I recently did some work with Energy Trust. ADM fielded their customer insights survey that had a very large number of respondents, so that we could get a lot of people of color and actually, you know, be able to slice it up among different groups. And we of course, one of the questions we asked was to people to identify their race and ethnicity, and then it was at a very high level of you know, differentiation. You know, they could identify themselves as Vietnamese American, or, you know, any you know, bunch of different types of Asian Americans. But then we lumped them all together, and I can tell you that from work that I was involved in while I lived in Thailand, aiding a Japanese university professor doing cross-cultural human resource management, looking at different Asian groups. They're not, you know, the Chinese, Vietnamese, Korean and Japanese and Thais, you know, aren't that similar. And so, you know, I recognize that there you lose a lot of the picture when you throw people into groups just based on, you know, whether their ancestors came from a particular very large chunk of the world. Sarah's nodding her head, but she's still on mute. So you have a thought.
It's always going to be challenging. You know, I think what would be the ideal, right? The ideal is that we're able to represent every individual and talk to every individual. And, you know, we should strive to talk to as many people as we can. I think it will always come down to the hard decisions of how do you condense so much rich information into something that people can, you know, digest and use to make decisions about programs. And that's just a decision I think you have to make in every research project based on what people need to know about the different individuals that are represented.
To tie this with a question that Sharon had also, is kind of like at the end of the day, the research should be designed to really answer the burning question, what's your goal, and trying to understand things. So then you start going like, well, is this a place where we combine quantitatively a bunch of people together, or do we qualitatively go after something and try to find the nuance? And it really has to happen up front so that you can recognize the goal of the research to make sure that it is actually culturally competent. And Sharon, to your point about, can you talk about making room for things you don't know and leaving space when the timeline or the budget's constrained? And I think that this is where long-term research plans where you build out kind of research questions that need to be considered next are really, really important. And then actually working with the client to be like, we think this is really important. I know that you can't go here now, but like, this is something we strongly urge. And as researchers, I think it's okay when you're working directly with a client who trusts you to be like, no, this right here, that's important.
Okay. Okay, good. Well, we are at time. We're a minute over. I wanted to see if Quinn had anything she wanted to add, because we haven't heard from her in the last few minutes. Any concluding thoughts from you, Quinn?
Thank you. I'm sorry, my camera appears to not be operating properly. No, I think that this conversation has ended in a perfect place where Alex mentioned that we have to plan and acknowledge that these questions are not going to be answered overnight, and we're going to have to prioritize. Of course, we need to make sure the programs are hitting their metrics and savings and budget goals, but at the same time, recognizing that we may be leaving someone or someone's behind. And it's important to do the research to understand who they are and how we make sure they're able to benefit from the programs that they're paying into.
Okay, and Harper would like to know how you get certified in CCE. Maybe as we are now officially 2 minutes over, maybe that's something you can or Harper can follow up with you on and offline and send you an email about that.
Absolutely. Anyone is welcome to follow up with me offline, and I can share the education that I've worked through over the last few years.
Okay. Carla says agenda says this goes to 12:45. Yeah, that may be my my error. Nick had advised me that it was 12:30, but I think because we don't have a breakout session, we can continue going to 12:45. Is that correct, Nick?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, well, good. Well, then we can continue partying and talk more. You know, one of the things I wanted to get back to, and I raised earlier the question of, you know, what are the potential impacts of a you know, inadequate consideration of cultural differences. I mean, I guess, you know, that's should be fairly obvious. You know, what the downside of that is. I'm wondering if you know, anybody wants to talk a little about you know, given the need to you know, shepherd our resources, are there certain characteristics of evaluations or types of evaluations that make CCE more important? I mean, obviously, one where, you know, your target community is going to be more diverse. It is one situation, but is there anything else where you know, we could just make this a little bit more explicit about where, you know, putting the resources into a really well-crafted, culturally competent evaluation is highly important. Anybody want to take that on? Quinn, do you have any thoughts on that? I'm going to start calling on the classroom if you don't volunteer.
I do have thoughts, but I was trying to figure out how I can articulate them clearly without it sounding too big. I think it's critical in all aspects. Like I don't know how to kind of condense it down to just where should we focus. I think there are folks that maybe have a very small population within your community, but they're suffering the most, the highest impact from some of the way we operate our programs, the way we operate our grid infrastructure. And while they may be just a very small population, they're important. It's worth our time investing. And then you may have very large communities of folks that for whatever reason aren't engaging well with your programs. And they are also very important. So I struggle with the question only because I I desperately want to figure out a framework where we don't have to always decide who's most important for us to put our attention and our focus towards. That being said, we all have finite resources, and if someone were to ask me, I would want to do some type of analysis on most impact for the population that's most highly receiving the most negative impacts from the way we're operating our programs. So that's my best answer, but I want to help everyone, I guess, at the end of the day.
I'm going to back you up there, Quinn. I think I think culturally competent evaluations, culturally competent research, culturally competent program design is actually something that should be a foundational element, like all research methods are, right? So when I know all about type 1 and type 2 errors and things like that, I start thinking about the invisibleness of what we haven't studied and how we haven't looked at things. We don't know the full impact of what we haven't studied. And in this case, I think it needs to actually be a foundational element in every single research and evaluation project we go through. I know that's hard and expensive, but we're also kind of at a sea change moment, I think, in the sense of where we need to put investment. You know, and especially now that, you know, we have all these low-hanging fruit, lighting's gone, all these things are happening. Yeah, it's harder now, but it's also, I think, with recognition that even if you're getting less savings, you're actually having a huge, larger impact. And this is the non-energy benefits element of things that you need to start thinking about too. So this shift is not only on the organizations, but also on the regulatory side, to recognize that this is a big thing that has to happen and give that space for it.
And just to add to that, you know, I have worked in evaluation and research, but most of my career has been in implementation. And I wonder if we can challenge this idea that doing this work will yield less savings, or that we won't be able to mitigate the cost in some way in the way we design and implement programs, because my logic leads me to believe if there's segments in our community that have not fully engaged in our programs, then there's savings to be had that we are not even aware of. And if you add some of the, you know, the way we look at our work, we talk about realization rates and net to gross and all these other numbers. We're talking about a whole population is not going to move unless we do something. We should be able to count every kilowatt hour in therm related to implementing any measures in those communities. We may find ourselves in situations where our programs are more cost effective than ever, and we're actually being impactful in the communities that haven't engaged in, you know, previously. So I just challenge us to rethink some of the assumptions we have related to engaging with underrepresented communities.
You know, some of the discussion was, I mean, you know, one of the central issues is of CCE is making sure that you are speaking in language that that, you know, your target audience understands, and that you're not making assumptions about, you know, what they understand or what, you know, something means to them, right? Jeremy talked a little bit about an evaluation where they realized it was better to ask open-ended questions than try to constrain people into a multiple choice. It's not really a matter of understanding particular words, but of, you know, giving people a way to respond. That I'm just wondering if anybody has examples of something where they realize that they just asked something wrong way, and you know, they've got responses that they later realized didn't mean what they thought they meant. Because I've got a great story about this. It comes from many years ago, and it's not really about a particular culture other than perhaps education level or being used to understand, you know, hearing a particular word used in a certain way. But this was back in the 1980s, and it was during the AIDS epidemic, and I was at a an award ceremony, being a TV news reporter was being given an award for a series she had done on HIV/AIDS, and she was saying that she had decided there was one point she was going to make every time she did a story, a segment, went out into the field, talked to people. She was going to take one thing and hammer it home just to make sure if people don't get understand anything else, they get this, and it was that you can't get it from casual contact. And so every time she was out in the field or did a story, she concluded with that. And she was out in the field once talking to somebody, and a guy came up to her and said, "So you can't get AIDS from casual contact?" And she said, "Yes." And he said, "So I can have sex with somebody once, and it's okay." So the story is that she realized that she was using this term, and assuming that everybody out there understood it the same way she understood it, and the people she spoke to, her friends, understood it, and there were people out there who had a completely different interpretation of what casual contact meant. So it's any examples like that, or just something where
I think that's, there's a lot of jargon in our industry. We're all tempted to kind of, I do it myself. I say DEI a lot when I should be saying diversity, equity, inclusion. And I think, testing our survey instruments or interview guides with people, real people, not from our industry, before we roll them out is really important to catch those language things that we might be using that are not going to serve us in our research.
Methodologically speaking, I mean, I think also if we're doing quantitative surveys, which I love to do, we should recognize that different cultures, different languages actually interpret scales differently and actually respond to them differently. So, Latinos are more likely to hit a higher end of the scale systematically, and then it's just different by different groups, and you have to recognize that it's a pretty systematic thing, well researched, and yet there's a lot of, this is where cognitive science is so awesome. Like, we need to just start talking through all these different elements because there's a lot of research out there. There's a lot of things that we just need to start being conversant across all of our different areas to get through and to learn from each other.
Okay. I think there's been a lot of work in engaging better with communities outside of energy that we really should be leveraging. I've been reading a lot of articles from the healthcare industry and how they're able to leverage community-based organizations to push for, interventions, medical interventions. And there's a lot of good work that's been done here that can translate well into energy. It just takes some time and some effort in taking these principles and applying them appropriately.
Okay. We need to wrap up now for real in about a minute. Harper just wanted to clarify Alex's comment about Latinos choosing higher points on scales. Can you clarify?
Yeah, it's something we've seen systematically. Say on a 10-point scale, they'll be on average a point or two higher. It depends on what it is, and you can actually rewrite the scales or bound them if you have a bunch of different statements to try to shift things around. But that's where that methodological concern about creating a solid survey, and just to Sarah's point of doing those cognitive interviews and talking to people beforehand so you recognize how the interpretation's happening is really important.
Okay. Okay. Harper says thank you. Okay, I think that's it. I think we've had a great conversation, everybody. I want to give our panelists a hand, everybody, and I'll be outside the conference room having coffee and eating a pastry in case anybody wants to discuss this further. Thank you all very much, and enjoy the rest of your conference.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.